Good evening. I want to welcome all of you to the annual Friends of the Nantucket Historical Association lecture, and to welcome and thank Sylvia Yount for agreeing to be our speaker this year. First, a word about the Friends. The Friends of the NHA was established 34 years ago by a small group of NHA supporters. The mission of the Friends is to seek significant acquisitions for the NHA collection. Support from the Friends has enabled the NHA to acquire numerous artifacts, works of art, and documents, and to ensure that these objects remain on Nantucket or return to the island to be enjoyed by the Nantucket community. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Knutson, who will introduce our guest speaker. Ann is a guest curator at the NHA. Last year, she curated the inaugural exhibition, 200 Years of American Art on Nantucket, in the new Williams Forsythe Gallery. It was a stunning, beautiful exhibition highlighting many of the acquisitions by the Friends over the years and many paintings on loan from private collections. Ann?
Thank you, Bill. It is a pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Sylvia Yount, the Florence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I first became aware of Sylvia in the 1990s when I was in graduate school and we had a field trip to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, the oldest art museum and school in the country. We had to parse through an exhibition and the permanent collection, and I remember reading the exhibition labels in the permanent collection galleries. I was stunned how good they were. They brought contemporary scholarship into the galleries and made these paintings come alive. So it turned out that was Sylvia, because Sylvia wrote those. She had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. She'd gotten her PhD in American art, and she had taken a job as curator of collections at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Sylvia and I didn't meet again for 10 years when we both landed in Atlanta. She became the Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, and I was working on an Andrew Wyeth retrospective at the time. Sylvia has curated many exhibitions, and one I remember vividly from the High was her Cecilia retrospective, both a Philadelphian and considered one of the finest portraits in the late 19th and 20th century. And I dog-eared that exhibition last year while I researched my 200 years of American art. Sylvia has organized many important exhibitions with excellent exhibition catalogs on topics like Will Homer, Maxfield Parrish, the American Aesthetic Movement, American Modernism, and most recently, Jacob Lawrence, a show that is opening in August, I believe, at the Met. She's currently working on a major Winslow Homer exhibition that's scheduled to open up in 2022. I present Sylvia now, here to tell us about the Met, 150 years old.
Thank you, Anne, for that gracious introduction. I think you were freezing just a little bit, so, but I actually had not heard that story about you coming with your UVA class to the Academy, so that's great. I know we had that Virginia connection too, and we do go way back, and I greatly appreciate you recommending me to the NHA for this talk. I also want to thank Bill and James and Lexi for inviting me to speak with you tonight via Zoom, and Mary and Al for their expert technical assistance. Now, I wish we could have come together on your lovely island in this middle of the dog days of July, but I hope there will be another opportunity to do so one day. Excuse me. So in person, the focus of my talk was to have been an exhibition titled New York Art Worlds, 1870 to 1890, co-curated by myself and my American Wing colleague, Thayer Tolles. And that would have recently opened in conjunction with the 150th anniversary of the Met's founding, which happened in April. That show has since been rescheduled for 2022 due to the museum's closure since mid-March and the inevitable shifts in our programming. One of the exhibitions that we will reopen with on August 29th, in addition to the Jacob Lawrence show that Anne just mentioned, is the cross-departmental effort titled Making the Met, the installation for which was all but complete when we closed our doors due to the COVID crisis. A well-known early 20th century photograph of visitors to the museum inspired the key promotional image for the show, as you see here, clearly altered and updated for 2020, but still highlighting Emanuel Leutze's epic Washington Crossing the Delaware as just one of the many iconic paintings in the collection of the American Wing, leading many to view us as offering a, quote, encyclopedic survey of American art, that's fine arts and decorative arts. Now, I would argue that no one museum can be fully comprehensive given the inherent biases that lie at the heart of so-called art historical canon formation, but we are privileged to hold many textbook examples of American art, including the Leutze. You have the next slide, please. Another icon of our collection, Frederick Edwin Church's Parthenon, had to be moved from our main two-tier gallery for installation in Making the Met in February, at which time my colleague Betsy Kornhauser proposed replacing it with William Bradford's Shipwreck off Nantucket. As James was interested in having me discuss a few Nantucket subjects that can be found in the American Wing, I'm happy to do that now. So Bradford, the artist explorer, best known for his impressive scenes of the North Atlantic and the Arctic, painted this work at his New Bedford studio in response to the news of the August 8th, 1859 incident with the whaling ship Nantucket, which ran aground that night near Nashawena Island at the entrance to Vineyard Sound. Bradford had traveled to the site, in fact, to observe the scene in preparation for painting this epic depiction of the shipwreck. He had recently worked alongside a painter named Albert von Beest, who had been trained in the tradition of Dutch marine painting, and the dramatic effect of the heavy seas and the tilting ship, certainly reveal that influence. But it was Bradford's impressive knowledge of American seagoing vessels that led to his careful delineation of the deck of the whaler and the small craft that surround it. So this painting can generally be found hanging in our loose center open storage area on the mezzanine of the American Wing. So we're very pleased to actually have an occasion to bring it into our main galleries. And I'm showing you a photo of that taken by a colleague of mine who had emergency access during closure. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned Church earlier, who is getting special attention in Making the Met as one of the museum's founding artist trustees. And another New York-based painter, Met trustee, featured in that anniversary effort, who had key influential ties to Nantucket, is Eastman Johnson. And as I'm sure many of you know, the artist established a studio on the island shortly after his 1869 marriage to Elizabeth Williams Buckley, who came from a progressive Quaker family in Troy, New York. Beginning in 1870, again the year of the Met's founding, and continuing for the next 30 years, the Johnsons spent summers at their North Shore property near the cliff. Most scholars agree that the artist's quietly evocative paintings of island life are the most inventive and appealing of his 1870s production, and the Met is lucky to own two of these works, a study for his ambitious Husking Bee Island of Nantucket, as well as the New Bonnet. And I'm super excited to hear that Anne is developing an exhibition for the NHA of Johnson's works from the 1870s alongside the production of Winslow Homer. By the time Johnson arrived on the island, its predominant whaling industry had been replaced by an enterprising focus on tourism, but those were early days, and it was really the picturesque character of the less than pristine Greek Revival houses and the island's overall quiet lifestyle seemingly fixed in the distant past that particularly appealed to his aesthetic. These two works, which were painted in the centennial year of 1876, marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the US, are redolent of the period's incipient colonial revival, a cultural phenomenon grounded in the national obsession with America's past as a simpler, more virtuous time. This revivalism was also defined by a fascination with ancestor worship, in which New Englanders in particular were widely regarded as exemplars of hardy independence and resourcefulness. In these terms, Johnson's paintings of Nantucket corn husking and cranberry harvesting carried particular resonance in the post-Civil War years as representations of voluntary communal labor in rural America, presented, of course, in pointed contrast to the slave and sharecropper economy of the South. And you may know that in the 1860s, Johnson, who held abolitionist sympathies, had painted a very strong series of images of African Americans. The colonial revival zeitgeist reached a high point in 1924 with the founding of the Met's American Wing as the first museum collection of 17th and 18th century American decorative arts and Americana displayed in the then novel setting of historical interiors or period rooms. But I digress. Tonight, I wanted to share more about the 1870s as a context for the founding of the Met, as well as a growing divide between establishment artists like Johnson and Church and a younger generation of French-trained men and women who were leading the campaign for progressive change in the New York art world, most of which was happening outside the new museum's doors. That is the focus of the American Wing exhibition now scheduled for 2022, placing the Met's early years in New York's broader cultural and artistic fabric. But first, I wanted to share a bit more about the institution's founding. And next slide, please. New York's idea for a municipal museum grew out of a successful art display at the 1864 Metropolitan Sanitary Fair, an event which raised money for Union troops. And I trust you can spy in this photograph to the left and to the right, Loitza's Washington Crossing the Delaware, and Church's Heart of the Andes, both now in the American Wings collection. Members of the city's Union League Club advocated for the founding of a, quote, permanent free gallery of art equal to New York's position as a national metropolis. Anticipating the rhetoric later heard by museum founders in Boston and Philadelphia, New York cultural promoters stressed the commercial as well as aesthetic advantages of museums for art lovers and manufacturers alike. Unlike the other cities' campaigns, however, the Met failed to gain the full support of the Knickerbocker set, that is patrician old New York, and remained a project of the industrial elite and established members of the art world, including railroad magnate and art collector John Taylor Johnston, retail merchant Alexander Stewart, publisher George Putnam, painters Church and Johnson, as I mentioned, Eastman Johnson, and art dealer Samuel Avery. Next slide, please. Opening to the public in 1870 in rented rooms of a former dance academy, of all things, the Dodworth building on Fifth Avenue in the 50s, the museum acquired its first original artwork, a Roman sarcophagus, a few months later. And then in 1871, more than 170 European paintings by artists such as Van Dyck, Poussin, and Tiepolo entered the collection. Then, roughly 2 years after that, having outgrown those rooms with new purchases, specifically the infamous Cesnola collection of Cypriot antiquities, the Met signed a lease on the former Douglas Mansion on West 14th Street, that is in Union Square, a neighborhood then emerging as a center of both high and consumer culture. Next slide, please. Frank Waller's circa 1881 retrospective imagery of the museum in its 14th Street home, which I'm showing you at right, suggests how the fine and decorative arts collections were installed in the then typical dense salon-style hanging at that Met. Of greater interest may be his depiction of the quietude of the Met's galleries, frequented by a lone and unchaperoned middle-class woman intently studying works of art, a detail that reveals the site to be a place of both security and edification. And the paucity of visitors that Waller captures in this and some other paintings that he did of the Met's interiors may also have stemmed from the building's famously insufficient heating, which apparently was the talk of the town, as a staff person wrote in 1875 to Met trustee and chair of the building committee, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., father of the future president. We know that the Douglas Mansion for a time comfortably held the museum's growing collection as well as loan exhibitions, including one in 1873 of more than 100 historical and contemporary paintings by both European Old Masters, Tintoretto and Turner in particular, in addition to the American expatriate James McNeill Whistler. So an interest in American art from the beginning. By the winter of 1879, however, the Met was moving up, literally, to its nearly finished building in Central Park, where we remain today. Next slide, please. The story of the succeeding years of the museum's tremendous growth is really the heart of the Making the Met exhibition, while the focus of the American Wing's upcoming New York Art World's effort fundamentally poses a different question, and that is, what was it like to be an artist living and working in New York during the 2 decades after the Met's founding? We're drawing principally on the Wing's extensive collections for this show, and in order to really investigate the vibrant cosmopolitan and modern art world that emerged in New York in those post-centennial years, laying the groundwork for today's international cultural capital. Select paintings, sculpture, works on paper, decorative objects, and artist books exemplify late 19th century innovations and trends, particularly those associated with the Anglo-American aesthetic movement that promoted a marriage of the beautiful and the useful. The works also reveal leading American artists' roles as trendsetters, organizers, exhibitors, and collaborators. For example, this little-known painting by Winslow Homer celebrating creative fellowship, painted in that locus of art world activities, the studio, as it's titled, will be featured in our show. Next slide, please. As I noted earlier, the exhibition examines how a younger group of progressive artists, many trained in Europe in the most advanced techniques, distinguished itself from the more established generation of painters in particular, such as those involved with the Met and the National Academy of Design, by spearheading a so-called new movement through their involvement in influential exhibitions and social clubs. Different sections of our show will focus on these artists as tastemakers, bonding with like-minded art critics, cultivating collectors, and working collaboratively on ambitious decorative projects. I'm showing you one of the many low reliefs in the Met's collection by the leading late 19th century sculptor and key new movement artist, Augustus SaintGudens. This is an innovative family portrait of the poet-editor Richard Watson Gilder, his artist wife, Helena Decay, and their 2-year-old son, Rodman, which was modeled in 1879. The Gilders occupied a central position, a key position, in the cultural marketplace of New York, radiating influence from their public offices of journalism and their private studio salon of artistic practice. As one of the city's primary custodians of culture, Gilder, who was the son of a Methodist minister, through the editorship of the respected journals, Scribner's Monthly, and after 1881, the Century Illustrated Monthly magazine, guided his middle and upper class readers in matters of public life and personal morality, employing art as a method of reform. Gilder was convinced that society's idealists, artists, and poets, as he termed them, were equally responsible for the improvement of public life and surrounded himself with the leading talents of the day, and SaintGudens was undoubtedly his favorite sculptor. Helena Decay, granddaughter of the Knickerbocker poet Joseph Rodman Drake, and sister of Charles Decay, who was the leading art critic, literary and art critic for the New York Times, was largely responsible for her husband's artistic contacts. A scion of an old New York family, Decay shared the cosmopolitan peripatetic background of Henry James, as well as Edith Newbold Jones, later Wharton, representative figures of the shrinking intellectual society of New York in the postbellum years. Next slide, please. After their 1874 marriage, the Gilders moved into a carriage house on East 15th Street, just off Union Square, converted to a living space by their good friend, the architect Stanford White. The studio, as it was known, which would be their home for 15 years, quickly became a cultural mecca for local and visiting artists, many of them fresh from Europe, seeking bohemian fellowship that was central to their experiences abroad. The Gilders' Friday night salons drew a variety of artists, writers, and theater people, including such close friends as SaintGudens, Stanford White, John Lafarge, Albert Pinkham Ryder, the young Walt Whitman. The Gilders were actually the first to publicly support his Leaves of Grass collection of poetry in the cultural sector, as well as actors such as Joseph Jefferson and Helena Modjeska. And the lasting influence of this cultural fellowship as integral to the artistic character of New York City at this time is really central, is a central theme of our exhibition. Next slide, please. Decay's singular devotion to her development as a professional artist that instigated the couple's Friday salons also led to a number of other important happenings, the organization of a Saturday morning sketch club, as well as the founding of the Art Students League, still in existence today, and the Society of American Artists. As a one-time student of Winslow Homer and John Lafarge, DYKER understood the need for young artists, especially women, to have alternatives to New York's establishment institution, the National Academy of Design, when it came to training, exhibition, and even sales opportunities. DYKER may be best known, not for her own artwork, but for this moving portrait of her by Winslow Homer, a work that some art historians have interpreted as expressing the artist's broken heart on the occasion of Helena's marriage to another. Next slide, please. And again, as so little of DYKER's own artwork survives, I'm pleased to be able to feature in our display a recently discovered paint box from her time as a student at the National Academy. And the nude figure study that you see there at left dates the object probably around 1871, when the first life drawing class was actually offered to women pupils there. And DYKER shared her academy studies and a studio in those years with another very soon to be important artist, and that was Mariah Oakey, later Mariah Oakey Dewing. This artifact comes from a descendant of DYKER, as most of her work has remained in the family, and that's the case for many women artists who traded a career in the arts for marriage and motherhood. Also, this dynamic circa 1888 proto-Ashcan urban scene at lower right of the New York Elevated is by an artist named Edith Mitchell, later Prellwitz, Edith Mitchell Prellwitz, a student at the Art Students League, which you'll recall DYKER helped to found, which also has recently been donated to the American Wing by a family member. Unlike DYKER, Prellwitz was able to combine her domestic roles with her art making, and her artist husband, Henry, who happened to be a star student of Thomas Wilmer Dewing, husband to Mariah Oakey, this is very incestuous, he had identified her as the stronger painter and remained a key supporter of her career throughout their marriage. Both the DYKER and the Mitchell works entered the Met's collection this year as 2020 gifts, marking our anniversary. The next slide, please. Another 150th promise gift is this lyrical watercolor by Fidelia Bridges from long-term Met and NHA supporters, Max and Pamela Berry, who I believe may be in tonight's audience, maybe out there virtually. This work will be featured in the section of the New York Art World's effort that looks at the importance of exhibitions and art criticism for the careers of individual members of various artist organizations. Bridges, a protege of William Trost Richards, the Pennsylvania Academy trained artist with Nantucket ties, is celebrated for her meticulously detailed watercolors of flora and fauna in close-up outdoor settings, largely painted near her home in Canaan, Connecticut. Over a successful 50-year career, she established her reputation as a pioneer in various ways, namely as one of only 2 women to be elected an associate of the National Academy of Design in 1873, and 1 year later as the 5th woman to be invited to join the American Watercolor Society, founded in 1866 to promote watercolor painting, then considered to be a very progressive medium. From 1876 to 1889, Bridges' images were reproduced and marketed by the popular Boston lithographer Louis Prang, and she also was very well known for her calendar and greeting card designs, as well as magazine and book illustrations, a typical path for many women determined to earn a living from their art in those years. This work, A Chickadee and Thistle, was painted 1 year after Bridges was inducted into the American Watercolor Society, when her, quote, little lyric poems were receiving considerable critical and popular acclaim. It exemplifies her impressive facility with the medium and exquisite sensitivity to its distinctive qualities of color and touch. And we're very excited to have this join another very different Bridges nature study in the Met's collection, thanks to the generosity of Max and Pam. And my last slide, please. So I hope my presentation has piqued your interest in paying a visit to the Met's American Wing in what we trust will be the safe, very safe year of 2022 to explore a transformational moment in the late 19th century when gender and class, artistic taste and lifestyles shaped the development of New York's global cultural power with innovative artists, men and women, at its center, where they always belong. Thank you.
Sylvia, We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
And the first one is, when is the Met going to open?
All important questions. Sorry, I thought I mentioned that at the outset. It's opening August 29th. It opens August 29th to the public, the whole museum. I'm going to take a sip here. I'll dry. And we open to members on August 27th and 28th.
Okay, perfect. And how are you going to, what's the protocol going to be given the COVID situation?
We're going to require everyone to wear a mask. We're not taking temperatures, and we're just relying on the great common sense of our visitors to maintain social distancing throughout the museum.
Okay. Here's another question. Can you talk about the political backdrop of the founding of the museum, and what was the political climate at the time?
It's a great question. It's a big question. Well, certainly 1870, we're in the middle of Reconstruction. In terms of New York City politics, I don't have those specifics right at hand. I'm sure there was something going on with Boss Tweed, inevitably, in those years. But as I said, what's interesting about the Met's founding is that it was not a institution that was founded by New York's oldest patrician set. It was actually the new industrial elite that really had the ideas and the inspiration for doing it, gathered in Paris, had a number of meetings, but really coming out of those the Sanitary Fair, which, as you know, Anne, led directly to the first World's Fair in Philadelphia, the Centennial Exhibition. So the fact that the Sanitary Fairs, I like to remind people, were actually run by women. They were pretty much organized and run by women. And they laid the groundwork, the foundation for so many museums in this country, including in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia. So in terms of the climate, certainly I think there was a real sense of, New York is now being seen as, of course, the national metropolis in terms of industrial production and kind of the cultural sector as well. But it was being seen as pretty much a money-making city that did not have kind of the same high culture or the interest in intellectual life or cultural life as Boston and Philadelphia. And as you probably know, Anne, as well, the MFA opened just about a few days after we did in 1870 in a very different format. But so there was absolutely a competition between those three cities, I would say, from the beginning, and New York being seen as a little bit more crass and too focused on the bottom line, so that this was seen as kind of a long time coming to actually want to have an art museum in the city. That was a long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that's good. Sylvia, can you talk about the facade that you go through when you enter the American Wing, the building facade?
Yeah, the bank facade, that's right. And that actually was literally the entrance to the American Wing when we opened in 1924. It was technically our first artifact to enter the collection. It's the former Second National Bank. And one of our founders, a wonderful couple, Robert and Emily DeForest, Robert was actually on the kind of an early iteration of a preservation organization in New York in those years. So he got the word early that bank was coming down while this was in the midst of he and Emily planning to build an American Wing that would be a part of the Met. So he actually nabbed that piece, and literally that was the door. It's still a door now, but it's in the larger Engelhard courtyard, of course, that gorgeous glass enclosed space we have. I showed you an image of there. But that was actually the 3 floors of the American Wing, and it was called a wing because it had a separate entrance in Central Park.
And were they considered the new money, or were they the old,
They were older money. The DeForest were definitely from older families, yes. And actually, Emily Johnston DeForest, her father was the first president of the Met, and Robert DeForest ended up being president of the Met as well before founding the wing.
Okay.
They're a fascinating couple, and I'm happy to say that in the Making the Met show, the American Wing, or American art, has a very important story, since we were collecting, it was an American institution, collecting American art at the beginning. And my colleagues Amelia Peck and Thayer Tolles have written a terrific essay about the history of American art at the Met that includes the founding of the American Wing, of course. And we have a whole kind of chapter in the exhibition that tells that story. So it's exciting. I hope you'll all be able to come and visit us and see that exhibition for yourself at some point.
And to confirm, when is that exhibition? Is that going to be
That is one of the 3 exhibitions that we are actually opening with. Well, actually 2 technically. That is Making the Met, and the Jacob Lawrence American Struggle exhibition will be open if you show up on August 29th or as a member, August 27th or 28th. Those 2 exhibitions will be open and accessible.
Could you talk a little bit about the Jacob Lawrence exhibition?
Yeah, that is an exhibition that actually was organized by the Peabody Essex Museum, not too far from you, in Salem. and it opened there in February. It's an exhibition that has been in the works for a number of years now. Some of you, I'm sure most of you have heard the name Jacob Lawrence, who's one of the leading 20th century modernists and certainly the most important African-American artist of his generation, kind of coming of age at the end of the Harlem Renaissance. You may be best familiar with his series, the 1940-41 series called the Migration series, that is half owned by MoMA and half by the Phillips Collection in Washington. And the Museum of Modern Art did have brought the two parts of the series together a few years ago. He is best known for that series, which really chronicled the migration of African Americans from the South to the North and the West in the years after the Civil War, certainly at the turn of the century primarily. But this is a series he did in 1954, actually, which is a period of his work that is not as well known to many people. In the moment of end of the Cold War, middle Cold War, McCarthyism, Joseph McCarthy's hearings were going on in these years, as well as the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. And it's an extraordinary series that's really his American epic. It's the full title is The Struggle of the American People to Forge a Democracy. I don't have the exact title at hand. A lot of ellipses in this title. But it's a project of, it was initially going to be 60 panels. He ended up painting 30, and it pretty much stresses from the Revolutionary period to the westward expansion. And it's a project that specifically looks at telling a more truthful, I would say, story of American history and the founding of this country, giving more attention to the oft-overlooked contributions of people of color and women. So as you might imagine, this project has become so extraordinarily resonant and timely. It was created at a moment of struggle and conflict by the artist in the mid-50s, and here we are opening it to the public in New York at this other extraordinary moment with our movement in social justice and so many other things happening in this country. And it's actually the first time that these 30-some panels are actually going to be brought back together, reunited. It was last seen in New York 60 years ago in one exhibition. After that, the panels were sold off individually. So a lot of people who even have the panels in their collection didn't realize it was part of a larger series. I think that's one of the reasons it's less known. As you can see, I'm very excited about this project, and I could keep talking about it for a while. So I'll stop there. But I should mention I'm collaborating with my wonderful colleague, Randy Griffey, who is a curator in the Modern and Contemporary department, because at the Met, Jacob Lawrence falls to the Modern department. But I had been a part of the project with the earlier organizer, and given its resonance with American history and many of the works in our collection. In fact, the reason why we were approached about participating in the show is because we own one of the 3 panels that are not owned by private collectors. There are only 3 panels in institutional collections. The Met has one, Harvard has one, and the Cantor Center at Stanford have one. The rest are all owned privately. And the panel that we have is actually Washington crossing the Delaware, which was acquired by the Met in 2003. Really clearly as a foil to the Leutze, and it's a very different image. I'm sorry I don't have it to share with you right now, but that's one of the reasons that I'm taking part in the project, and I've also done a lot of work on Lawrence over my career.
Wow. Okay, you answered every question.
It's going to be a great show. It's such an exciting show.
So another question is, after the opening, will you have any programming, lectures?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, we're not going to have any on-site programming through the end of the year. That is one of the precautions we're taking, of being concerned about bringing groups of people together, obviously. So while we're open to the public for exhibitions, the only food service that's going to be open at the time is in the American Wing. So I hope I'll be seeing many of you in the American Wing for grab and go. But we're going to have a very robust virtual program series going on. We've been doing that really since the end of March. All becoming kind of very conversant with Zoom and different formats. So for the Lawrence Show in particular, we have some extraordinary programs coming up that will be happily, accessible to more people, because it won't just be how many people can fit in the gallery for the program or in the auditorium, but we can send it out much more widely. I think the biggest disappointment for me is, since we won't be able to have people in the galleries, and given this is such a rich and resonant show about complicating American history, we will not have school groups that we can have there with us. So the educational program, again, will need to be broader and more diffuse and remote, but we're hoping to make the most of that. And this is an exhibition that also will close November 1st, so literally on the eve of probably the most important election in many of our history. So it's a very interesting show to be exploring at this time.
So it'll close and it won't go anywhere else.
I'm sorry, it is. Yes, actually, the reason why we can't hold it over, it's a national tour. So it opened at the Peabody. We are the second venue. And then it's actually going to Birmingham, Alabama, to Birmingham Museum of Art. It's not too far from Atlanta. You can see it there. And then from there, it will go to, I believe, still Seattle, which is a city where Lawrence taught and lived toward the end of his life after moving from New York. And then it will close at the Phillips Collection in Washington, largely because, of course, there are great interest in Lawrence and having half of the migration series.
Okay. Wow.
So it will, yeah, it has a long run.
All right. Here's another great question. Can you talk about the integration of the DYKER Collection, am I pronouncing that correctly, of Native American art into the American wing?
I have so many knowledgeable people out there I could see, like they're all bigger questions. I'm sorry I didn't talk about any of these things. Yes, the DYKER Collection is an extraordinary collection of historical Native North American art that came to us in 2018 as a promised gift. And we opened in the American wing in the fall, October of 2018, this very rich, extraordinary survey of works from 50 different indigenous cultures. Chuck and Val have been long-term supporters of the Met, had long hoped the collection would come to the Met someday, but they felt very strongly from the beginning, it's kind of relevant to the Lawrence discussion too, that Native North American art was American art, was kind of the first American art, and really needed to be seen in the context of the American experience, American history. So what's really a watershed for us and for many institutions is that this is the first time that this historical Native American art is being seen in the context of a primarily Euro-American collection that is in the American wing. Previous to the DYKER's Promised Gift, it was being shown a very small footprint we had in the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. So we didn't have a great large collection of Native American art that we were sharing, and it was literally 4 city blocks away from the American wing. So it's been a very exciting journey for all of us. I'm not expert in this material, and as you know, as American art historians, we are not trained in Native American art. That is starting to shift happily. I think many of our colleagues in academia today are taking that on more, but it's been an extraordinary opportunity for the Met, for the American wing, and all of my colleagues to be exploring that in greater depth. And I'm happy to say that we are hoping to have a specialist join us very soon who can work with us. We had a special guest curator for the initial installation, Gaylord Torrance, an extraordinary curator at the Nelson Atkins Museum, who's long worked with the DYKERs. But that exhibition, it opened in the fall of 18. It was in its current iteration, it was only going to be up for a year. It's now been up for a year and a half, given the closure. And then it will be rotating over time because there's a lot of light sensitive material, textiles, and other materials that can't be on permanent view. So the current installation will run through the end of January, and then we will be doing a rotation that will reopen in April. But if you come again this summer or this fall, you will see that work on view in the American wing, where it will remain.
Okay. All right. And then I answered this. Will there be a virtual tour of the Lawrence exhibition? Will you have virtual tours?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, we've been talking about that. We had a big meeting with digital this week. And since there are 30 panels, what we're planning to do, all the panels will be available online. We have, if you go on our website for any exhibition, we have these very robust exhibition pages that include all of the works in the exhibition, kind of a checklist of the exhibition, as well as the didactics, label copy, and then a lot of other, contextual information and references. The panels are quite small. They're 12 by 16, which was Lawrence's favored scale, and they're tempera on panel, so paintings. So given their scale, we're not sure like a virtual walkthrough would be as effective. It's also in just one gallery. But we're exploring that, and we're certainly going to be doing some filming, yes, for those people who can't actually get into the space, definitely.
Okay. All right. And then I really do want you to talk about your Winslow Homer exhibition.
Another great, yes, 2022 project that we're really excited about. And, it's amazing. I mean, all of us who've been kind of working remotely, I think we all would agree, it's extraordinary how productive one can be doing this. And I never thought I'd be able to plan an exhibition remotely, but working with our designers and educators and colleagues. And this is This is an exhibition I'm co-curating with my American Wing colleague, Stephanie Herdrick, who's an associate curator in the American Wing. And it's really looking at Winslow Homer with a fresh lens in a different context. It's looking at his work through the theme of conflict and struggle. And in fact, this is, again, a project that we developed a number of years ago. It's just feeling much more timely and resonant. The initial idea that Stephanie had for the show was really to place the Gulf Stream, which is our great Winslow Homer, the icons of American art, and widely considered to be the most complex and sophisticated of his paintings, painted in 1899. And it was painted in the Caribbean, and we're taking a look at this, particularly his kind of Atlantic world production, his Caribbean work, the paintings, the watercolors. And then we're looking at that theme that's really fully manifest in the Gulf Stream, and then tracing it throughout different key parts of his career. So while I wouldn't call it a full-scale retrospective along the lines of the last major Homer show that was held at the Met in 1996, which was the Great Homer Show that had been organized by the National Gallery, by Frank Kelly and Nick Sikowski. We're not trying to replicate that. We really want to put Homer in a slightly different context, ask different questions about his work, and then trace these themes again, because it's a theme that consumed him throughout his life, you know, from the early Civil War pictures to Reconstruction, issues of race and nature and the environment, you know, stretching all the way to the late Marines that he painted in Prout's Neck. But a lot of people don't know that he was very focused on the Gulf Stream as actually the North Atlantic current throughout his career. And he happened to name this one great painting after that. But he was painting, as most of you know, born in Boston, and then painting from, you know, Cape Ann, all the way to, goes over to England, of course, at some point, through the Caribbean, and then up in Maine. So he's someone who really, we think, understood the ecosystem of the Gulf Stream, and we're looking at that in terms of these kind of broader thematic focuses. So it's going to be a big show for us. It's about 95 paintings. We're setting out our loan letters right now, but we feel very confident that we're going to have a very strong array of works. And it will be opening at the Met in April of 2022. And then we're excited, it's actually going to be then traveling to the National Gallery in London, where it will be in the fall of 2022. And there was a smaller Homer show at the Dulwich Gallery many, many years ago that looked at Homer and the sea in kind of a very focused way. There hasn't been a major undertaking, a major examination of Homer's career ever in London. So we're really excited, given the Atlantic world context especially, we're excited to have a partner with Chris Riobel of the National Gallery.
All right, awesome. Any other questions? I see a shameless one from James here, Sylvia. I'm sorry about this.
Well, I still even haven't met James. I know you're out there somewhere.
He says, in 2021, curator Dan Elias plans a major exhibition featuring extraordinary maritime paintings. We'd like to talk to you about your fabulous Bradford.
About the Bradford, absolutely. You know, it's funny because, as I said, that I've been at the Met now almost 6 years, and that has never been on view in the main galleries. It's always been in our loose center. And I'd have to ask Betsy, I don't think it's been on view since they redid the wing, you know, in 2011. It is a large painting, and certainly, we will absolutely talk to our conservators, James, but we will happily entertain that loan request.
Think about the context we could put that in, Sylvia.
Exactly. Well, and I wanted to know more about that accident, that wreck. I mean, extraordinary that moment too. I'm thinking like John Brown, 1859. You know, what an interesting moment in this country too.
That would be really
fascinating to explore that more.
No, wait,
and on your own, can you speak a little bit more about your project? I know it's just in the early stages, but.
Well, we're in the early stages, and we're looking at doing a show of Eastman Johnson and Winslow Homer in the 1870s. Both artists focus in on images of women, intelligent women, thinking women, reading women. Why is that? And there are tons of reasons. So we're looking at what was in the air, what were all the pressures on them, focusing on this particular topic. In Nantucket and the women's suffrage movement here,
absolutely.
There's lots going on. And they were looking at each other too. So, but Nantucket features prominently in the Eastman Johnson side of it. But to be continued as we develop it. But thank you for asking about that. I don't think there are any more questions. Jim, James, anybody have anything else? Clap, clap, says James Russell. Love it. So Bill, I think we're done. Sylvia, that was so awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What's a real pleasure. Again, I wish we could have done this in person and kind of extended it a bit more, but I'm happy to be able to be with you virtually, and great to reconnect with you, Anne.
come back next year and give us a live.
We'll talk about Winslow Homer. We
Yes.
can talk about our Winslow Homer projects.
There we go. All right.
Great focus.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thank you all. Enjoy your summer and come visit us at the Met.
Sylvia, I want to, am I on?
Yes, Billy.
Okay. Sylvia, I want to thank you again on behalf of the Friends for being our speaker this evening. I'm sure that our members and guests enjoyed your fascinating account of the Met's founding 150 years ago and your focus on the progressive women who were at the center of the late 19th century New York art world as much as I did. I hope we'll see you in person on Nantucket in the not too distant future so that we can give you a proper thank you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
In closing, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Stay safe and good evening.